So with the hotspot, it's fairly basic in that it's a device that connects over the radio to the internet and therefore into other systems. So in the example behind me, this is actually the repeater that's out in the back room. You say, but hang on, it's running Pi-Star. Pi-Star is what people use on hotspots. That's correct, it is. It can also be used on repeaters. And therefore, what's the difference between a repeater and a hotspot? As far as the software is concerned, absolutely nothing. But as far as the physical hardware, that's where the main difference is. So in the example here, this is Pi-Star. This is probably, with the exception of the embedded ones that are going around the room, this is the predominant system that hotspots use. It's been designed in such a way that it's the least amount of user input for the maximum amount of productivity, in theory. That said, it does a lot, and in some ways it's a little too oversimplified, and even though you go, oh, hang on a minute, what's all this? But once you've used it for a while, you'll soon realise that there are some limitations to Pi-Star that may or may not suit your needs going forward. However, in this case, I looked at it when I was asked to build the digital repeater out the back. I thought, okay, we need to look at this from a practical point of view, and that is, going forward, it's not always going to be me who's going to be the person maintaining it. It needs to be done in such a way so that anybody can maintain it. And going down this route, I figured was the easiest way, because it's the most user-friendly interface. I'm sure that's on heat. Yeah. Now, of those devices that were going around the room, you would have noticed two of them called Openspot. Now, the Openspot brand is the commercial device that is available as a hotspot. Of those two, the all blue one is now an obsolete product. That was known as just the Openspot. That is capable of D-Star, DMR and C4FM, just those three modes. And it was, I think it was released, I think, in about mid-2017. I think it was around about then. It was in 2017 anyway. And it was discontinued, I think it was about mid-2018, and replaced with what's known as the Openspot 2. Now the Openspot 2 almost looks identical to the Openspot 3 that went around the room. The main difference is the Openspot 2 is, it has a Wi-Fi, but it doesn't have an internal battery. The Openspot 3 does have a small LiPo battery in there, so this is a full, as it is, it's not configured for the network here. You could turn it on, it would fire up. If I had my phone set into as a hotspot, so it's a hotspot to a hotspot, it would then be the bridge between radio, hotspot, cellular network, out to the rest of it. Now the price tag on these, this one, the Openspot 3 as it currently is, they land here. They come from is it Estonia or Latvia? Estonia. They're about 450 euros landed, give or take a bit. So they're very expensive for what they are. The advantage with those particular units, if you don't want to mess around with any of this, that one is probably the one you'll want, because it is still web-based driven, as in you configure it with a web page, but the way it's set up internally, it's pretty much set and forget. So once you've got it set up for whatever mode you want to use, that's it. You just leave it at that. As far as its updates are concerned, it automatically goes and grabs its updates if you leave the thing on 24/7. Whereas the original version, you had to manually flash the updates on those. As I say, they are very expensive for what they are. Occasionally they do run discounts on their products, and it's usually when they're about to clear them out to make, release a new product. So that is those. Now, as I say, they are a truly embedded system, so minimal footprint as far as what their software is, and hardware-wise, they're almost identical to the others here. The main difference is what's driving the software that's driving them. The original one, as I mentioned, is only limited to 3 modes, because that was all that was really being used at the time when this was released. Its replacement 2 times over. This does all 5 modes that are currently generally used in amateur radio, which is D-Star, DMR, C4FM, NXDN and P25. That's the digital modes. Now, some of those modes you probably haven't heard of or don't think that they're in use. Well, we beat the TAS GRN because P25 has been active here in Hobart since 2018. So we beat their time scale as to when they thought that was going to be running. Anyway, that's just a mind you, though, the technical side of the P25 network that they'll be running is much more complex than what we're running. These other ones cover the same modes as that, all 5. Now, the difference is here, I don't know how this is going to show, but as you saw, you went around the room, you know, this one's got one, I've got 50 ohm dummy loads on these. So you've got 1 termination, you've got 2 terminations. So this is the Simplex, or single frequency hotspot, and this one's the duplex. So this is the one that you treat basically like as a micro repeater. So for DMR, you can put in, well, they need at least a 5 meg split for them to be semi-reliable. I'll come back to that in a moment. So you put in a frequency pair and program them like a repeater. So this thing here, when it's running, will appear just like that, in that when we come down the side, you'll notice it has, I don't know if the mouse is visible on the screen behind me, but you've got D-Star, you've got D-Star, you've then got DMR, YSF in this case, or C4FM, you've got P25 and NXDN. So you've got all 5 modes active on this one. And you'll notice here it's got timeslot 1, timeslot 2. Now when you're using the Simplex one, timeslot 1 will be disabled. You won't have access to it. Now that brings up the question of, okay, on DMR we have 2 time slots. How do we deal with 2 time slots if that's only capable of receiving 1? Well, there's a little thing called rewrite rules, and that's where within Pi-Star you can put in a certain bit of syntax into a given area in the configuration line, and basically tell that if talk group, say talk group number 5, is received on time slot 2, but you actually want it to be on time slot 1. So it's kind of like a statement like that. So it's it flows in that way. So then when that traffic goes out over the net, instead of it being flagged as time slot 2, it gets flipped over to time slot 1. That's important when it comes to the VK DMR network. For example, I used talk group 5 there because that's the one that's used on a Sunday morning for the broadcasts. If your Simplex hotspot is configured to monitor multiple talk groups, which most of you that are using hotspots have them set up that way, this is where you can run into the problem with the Simplex one, where it's like a first in, first out when it comes to the talk group. So if something pops up on, say, 505, and that comes up onto the thing, and then there's traffic on talk group 5 at the same time, I can't remember the URL off the top of my head. It's going to try and show it. Obviously you can only receive 1 time slot at a given time, so what it gets displayed as on the VK DMR status page, you'll see a red bar where it's got the second traffic of a Simplex hotspot. Let's just see if I can remember. Let's see. that's good. Full screen. So, in this particular instance here, you'll notice that this, we'll use VK1BF here as an example. That's not going to highlight the way I wanted it to. Anyway, so there's his ID. Here's time slot 1 and here's time slot 2. So he's got statically set. So in other words, if there's any traffic on talk group 5, 3809, 3810, he's got those three set so that he'll receive any traffic that's on those three talk groups. That's on time slot 1. Over here on time slot 2, he's monitoring 505, 3801, 2, 3 and 4. Likewise again, any traffic that comes in on those talk groups, he'll receive those. Now, if this hotspot was a simplex one, which I'm going to guess it probably is, okay, there's an example. See how it's orange? It goes through like that. If there was somebody down here that was receiving on talk group 1 and there was traffic on time slot 2, they would get a red, instead of orange there, they would get red against their call sign. In this particular case, that's not the case, but that's what would happen, and that's the limitation with using a simplex hotspot over a duplex one. This is just for DMR. As far as D-Star, NXDN P25 and C4FM is concerned, you gain no benefit in using a duplex hotspot on those modes at this point in time. However, for DMR, which is the primary mode that most people are using, the duplex one does give you that benefit, so it essentially becomes your micro repeater. Now let's get back to the other one. Used to be F11, wasn't it? We used to make that full screen. Now for some reason, and I'm not too sure what's happened here, but when we go on the configuration page, it'll always ask you for a username and password. Now, the username and password, the username I definitely remember, the password I've either forgotten or it's somehow been changed. So I don't have access to the configuration in the web GUI on this at this point in time, which there was something there I was going to show, but obviously I can't as a result of that. This is where I was going to show the differences of all the different bits and pieces, but unfortunately I can't get into that, so, and it will probably just add an extra layer of confusion to it all. So, getting back to the hotspots, in that, okay, if you've got a repeater in your area, like there's three digital repeaters in the south, 2 are hosted at Clayton's Place in Lenna Valley. One of those is on 2 meters. That is on for the DMR side of things, that's on the Brandmeister DMR network, and also on D-Star. And on UHF at Clayton's Place on 70 centimeters, he has a dedicated DMR repeater, which is part of the VK DMR network, which is Australia's own amateur DMR network. There are some other, when I say other minor servers, the major players are Brandmeister, which is out of Germany, and for Australia in particular is VK DMR is considered the local server. There are some worldwide connections on that service, but for all intents and purposes, the majority of people are only using talk groups related to states and or Australia-wide. You can see here, you have a look, you've got D-Star, DMR, DMR, D-Star, because what's actually going on at the moment, at the same time as we're doing this talk now, there is actually a broadcast going on D-Star. So all the call signs you see there is relevant to that broadcast. In fact, it's probably VK3PG that's actually doing the broadcast, and the caveat is when you're doing a broadcast on digital is nearly everything is set with a 3-minute timeout timer. So most people have been designing systems using an Arduino to control the PTT line, to drop it for a second and then re-go again for another 179 seconds. So it's enough to drop it. Yes, you get that interruption for a second whilst it drops, but that's how Clayton does it for the Sunday morning one. It's set up with an Arduino controlling the PTT. That's necessary because otherwise you'd only get the first 3 minutes. The radio itself would eventually time out, and you just wouldn't hear anything. So that's what's currently going on there. Unfortunately, there is no examples there of what's happened outside of D-Star and TMR. In this particular case here, this line here, pretty obvious where it says here local RF activity. So what's in the top here is what's come over via the internet. What's down the bottom here is what's actually been received locally by the repeater. So in this case it's VK7TW, and he was on 3807 at 25 past 7 this evening for all of 1.4 seconds.
On your Harry.
Basically a chunk. Well, that's the other thing too, is with digital, not depending on how you set up your hotspot, you don't have to have static talk groups set on a hotspot. You can have the thing set purely dynamically, so that means you actually have to key up on the talk group for it to start working on that talk group. Some people find that the better way to run their hotspot, because then if you want a particular conversation that you want to have on a given talk group at a given time, you just key up and do it. Otherwise, if you've got too many statically set talk groups, you can essentially lock yourself out of your hotspot. A good example of that would be talk group 91 on the Brandmeister system, which is a worldwide channel. That essentially is constant key down 24/7, with predominantly people just pressing the button, or they might put out a CQ and then carry on a conversation for 3 hours, etc. So that's a good example of not to set 91 on the Brandmeister network as a static, unless you specifically want it to be on there, because you're going to have it keyed up for a very long time. Advantage of these hotspots is they're not like a conventional transmitter. These things can transmit 24/7 and there's no heat. It's not like a standard PA block where obviously you'd have to consider heat. The ADF 7021 chip is basically a radio in a chip, and they are good. I think it's about either 10 or 15 milliwatts is what they'll put out, and you think, oh, that's not much, but realistically most of the time you've probably got your hotspot sitting somewhere near your home router, and you can be anywhere in the house generally within 15-20 metres. It's going to work fine. The biggest problem is actually more your handheld, which depending on what power level you run the handheld on, the handheld's probably, if you're running it at 5 watts, that's going to be the major interference device, not the hotspot. No, I'm not going to go there. So nationally at the moment there's actually only 2 nominated 70 centimetre frequencies for hotspots. And one is 439.150 and the other I believe is 439.125 or 175, it's one or the other. So you think of that, 2 frequencies for the whole country for everybody's hotspot to live on. That's going to create an absolute nightmare, especially if you've got multiple users that kind of are close by. You know, your neighbour 3 doors down just happens to be a ham. You've both got hotspots. You're both running on the same frequency, which is not a good idea. How do you deal with that? Software in both the Openspot and Pi-Star has the ability to lock the device to just your call sign or ID number, which has been a bit of a topic in the last 12 months or so more or less making it mandatory, even though there's no legislation, particularly here in VK, to have it that hotspots are a single user device, in that you wouldn't set one up, set it up somewhere in a predominant spot and allow just anybody that's in the area to use it. And the reason for that comes back to that frequency sharing, that if you've got, I don't know, 15 amateurs all sharing the one frequency that all happen to be within earshot of each other, especially the handheld, not so much the hotspots. The hotspots are pretty deaf. You'll only get, if you actually have an antenna on, and those have all got dummy loads, with the exception of the Openspot, you'll probably get about 100 metres with an antenna on those. Reliable, you can talk to the hotspot. You'll hear the hotspot, no problem. It's whether the hotspot's going to hear you. They're purposely made deaf so that in that circumstance where you've got multiple people within the one area, that they're not going to receive absolutely everything. It is definitely not recommended, especially for the duplex ones, never put an amplifier on the output of one of those hotspots. The ADF7021 chip, although it's being manipulated in the way that it is, if you look at it on a spectrum analyzer, you've got more signals adjacent than what is nice. They're horrific, especially if they've not been set up correctly. Which kind of comes to another point which is a bit hard to show because I can't actually get into the calibration side of this one that's live. Plus there's a broadcast on and I don't want to interrupt if there's people listening to that. So yeah, hotspots can be restricted to single call sign or multiple call signs, but generally you only restrict it to yourself. And that is the preferred way of using them. Okay, I have an exception there in that I have a system set up on 2 meters, and essentially that is a tape 8110 FM mobile running at about 5 watts or thereabouts. That is actually into the same controller board that's being run on RAD, so it's identical as far as what the repeater runs. The only difference is because it's on a simplex frequency, it's not full duplex. I have that open on the DM on all the modes, just in case there happens to be somebody down in the Kingston area that wants to access a digital mode. They can go through mine, because you will not get into the repeaters here in the city from Kingston on a handheld. Just not going to happen. Which kind of comes back to that core thing, well, why would you have a hotspot if you've got repeaters? Well, you will get that situation where you're in an area where there is actually nothing that you can receive, or you may be able to receive it, but the 5 watt handheld you're using is not enough to get back to the repeater. If we go back onto, if I can remember what to do here, we go back over to this page, let's make it full screen again, and we come down to the bottom where we'll see VK7's listed. No, that's not what I wanted. Right, so where do the VK7s start? We have, whoops, just updating, so you've got VK7 BOBs, the first one there, and you've got Dale, EV, and you've got, you can see there's quite a few call signs there, and some of them have got two devices. That's fine. The way that's dealt with in this particular case, let's find one there. I cite that failing. You'll notice the ID number there. In this case, was it 5050778? They've just appended 2 digits. That's how you deal with having multiple devices in the DMR side of things. It's not ideal, but it works. That's the temporary solution for that. Some of these stations here, you'll say, well, hang on a minute, they're within range of the repeater here. Why are they using a hotspot? Because that's their preference. It could be that they might want to listen to something else, not necessarily on DMR in this particular case, because this is all this is showing is just DMR, talk groups, and time slots. They might decide that there's another mode that they want to listen to on a completely different thing that the repeater either may or may not be configured to use, so therefore they use their own. Perfectly valid reason. You don't have to use repeaters, you don't have to use hotspots, it's totally up to yourself. I'm of the belief of use the repeaters before using a hotspot. However, I'm the biggest hypocrite there, because what do I use? I use hotspots because I can't reach the repeaters from home. And you say, well, don't use the handheld, go and get something that can. Yeah, that's a fair comment, but handhelds is predominantly what I have at home for these digital modes. So that's about that side. I didn't really plan anything beyond about here, so I'm going to throw it open to questions, and please by all means think of your worst question and see if I can actually answer it. So, about time-wise.
Scott, can we go back to that other page?
Yeah.
And yes, I can hear repeaters, but I can't get into them with a handheld.
Yeah.
Which is why I use a hotspot.
Yeah.
Even though Clayton's repeater is just across the hill from me.
You can't get into this one?
I can get into this one if I'm up the top of the block.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
Which is what? Now, you can see there, I've configured the hotspot.
Where are you?
5 and 3809, and then a whole bunch of others.
Yeah.
I run a Zumspot.
Yep.
And there's a limitation as to the number of
talk groups you can monitor.
Correct.
5 per time slot.
Yeah. That is a Zumspot.
No, it is written into the MMDVM host software that's making that limitation.
Okay.
Going back to the original spec of DMR, there actually is no limitation on what you can limit to,
Right.
because realistically a fleet of DMR radios are generally only going to be using a limited number of talk groups anyway, and most of the time it's only going to be focused on, depending on what it's being used for, probably even 1 or 2 talk groups, and that's it. They don't live on anything else, because you'll have parallel traffic that is irrelevant to each other, and so that's it. But in the hotspot realm, there was a limit put on, and I don't know the exact reason, but it's most likely, logically, if you start going beyond 5 per time slot, you're asking that hotspot to receive a lot of data that you'll most likely end up missing most of it, because you can only, once it's locked onto a given talk group, it'll remain on that talk group until you have like a hang time, which is visible in the configuration. Its default is 20 seconds, so it would hang with, say, talk group 5. Traffic stops, it'll sit there for 20 seconds, then it'll reset, and if there happens to be anything else on that time slot, it'll then grab into it. The same can happen in between overs. If it's on talk group 5 and there happens to be any other traffic on time slot 1, it'll then lock onto that, providing you've got it in your static. So in your case, you've got 5 and 3809. So let's just say you've got the broadcast going out on talk group 5, and there's that little reset ka-chunk because of the 3-minute timer, and somebody happens to be talking on 3809. Whilst that little thing goes down, you're going to end up flipping over to 3809 and then losing the, listening to the broadcast until they either clear or you manually intervene and key up on 5 locally on your hotspot. That's why monitoring too many static talk groups can actually be a disadvantage, because one, you can lock yourself out of your own hotspot and it's just transmitting 24/7, no good to you then, or that you'll end up losing a conversation. It's very easy, especially if you're using one hotspot across multiple modes, which I did that for about 6 months, and it drove me absolutely mad, because I could be having a conversation on DMR and then it'd flip over to D-Star, flip over to C4FM, because I was only using those 3 modes at that time, and you'd just lose conversations. So it became, that's why setting hotspots up as a static device instead of a dynamic device instead of a static device can be beneficial.
So can you go into that in a little bit more detail?
Right.
So if I want to listen to the broadcast
Mm-hmm.
and I've configured it for dynamic mode,
Yep,
I would have to key it up on 5.
that's correct.
Is there a timeout for it staying on?
There is. Now on the VK DMR network, it should actually tell you, it'll probably tell you, I was looking, no, how do we get up the top? A little slow way. What we got here? Some talk groups have different hang times than others, and I'm just trying to find an example of that. And I'm not sure that we're in the right tab, but essentially some of them are set up with either about a 10, 15 or 30 second hang time. Some are just set up with 5 seconds. So the downside of that is, of course, if you wish to listen to talk group 5 and if for whatever reason in that little ka-chunk break that's taken to reset the transmitting radio, yours decides to stop receiving and then it times out, you've then got a ka-chunk on the talk group 5 again for it to spring to life. That's where in Pi-Star you can actually use the System Cron to configure, okay, we want talk group 5 to be active between say 9 AM to 10 AM on a Sunday morning, and there's a little script that's within Pi-Star that can be run to actually do that from the command line. So from the cron job you can actually say this is what we want it to do every Sunday at 9 AM, you know, do this, and then after it obviously releases. Now that's kind of like an advanced feature of Pi-Star, because it's more actually, the scripts that are available are actually available across all modes. So you've got the ability to do that with either mode. If you wanted it to monitor a particular talk group, whatever reflector, room, whatever jargon is associated with the associated mode, you can do so by setting it up that way, which I was nearly going to do on the repeater here, but the traffic that's on 5 during the week is not really worth worrying about, so I didn't bother. So there is quite a few advanced features within Pi-Star. Now, I haven't researched the Openspot as to whether or not they can do that kind of a thing. I would assume that they could, but as to how it's implemented, not sure.
What's the assume the convention around 3807 is preferred to be VK7.
Yeah.
3805 is preferred to be
VK5.
South Australia.
Yep.
Etc. Etc. So that's and what's the sort of the talk group that is Australia that's commonly used Australia-wide?
Okay. Glad you asked that question. Yeah. Why didn't that copy?
It's not a Dorothy Dixer either.
Why is copy and paste not working on this device? So, where do we got here? I must admit I haven't looked at this for some time, but somewhere under one of these titles has got the listing for what the talk groups that are available. Here we go. So, starting from, let's just come back up to the header there. So this is specific to the VK DMR network only. So as it notes there, talk groups in blue, are user activated. In other words, you have to key up on them before they'll do anything. And all these talk groups are available on RAD out the back here. RAD, however, is configured to monitor both 505 and 3807 on timeslot 2, and on timeslot 1 it is set up to monitor talk group 5 and talk group 8. Now the talk group 8 on timeslot 1 it's set up as a, I suppose you call it, the closest thing that could be the closest thing to explain it would be a cluster. So there's a number of repeaters on that talk group 8 timeslot 1 that when you key up on it, it will key up other repeaters within Tasmania. I think it's predominantly set up for RAD, RCR and RJG in the north for DMR. I think that's all. There might be others, but that's the three that I'm definitely aware that it does. And you say, well, that's the same as keying up on 3807. Yes, to a degree, but no. In that 3807 will key up any repeater that is monitoring that talk group, irrespective of where it's physically located, whereas talk group 8 will only key up on the ones within VK7 that have been configured on the server that it's talking to. So that's server-based configuration that the end user has no control over, but it's set up in that way. So if you wanted to just talk in Tasmania, but you didn't want to tie up timeslot 2, because with timeslot 2 you've also got 505, and your state-based ones, it can get busy and you can sometimes get denied because there's no free space for you to transmit. That's where talk group 8 on timeslot 1 fixes that problem for you. Keeps you in Tasmania, although within reason, within Tasmania, and it puts you on timeslot 1, which, provided it's not being used, this is the trade-off with DMR in particular. You only have the 2 time slots, and if one's in use, then obviously it's in use. You have to wait till it's free. You've got to think of the benefit of that is, though, you've got 2 conversations that are happening on that single frequency. That was the whole purpose of why DMR was made the way it was. It was to improve efficiency of frequency use. And that's not just specific to DMR, that's the same for all digital modes. Their basis was to add more voice capacity to a single frequency. I'll go off on a tangent here with Tetra. Tetra has 4 time slots, so you can have more fun on the single channel of Tetra. So, and I actually have a Tetra node running at my place at the moment, which is an experimental one. However, you won't receive it because it's still on the dummy load because I haven't put an antenna up for it.
So when you say there's 4 time slots, it's still 25 kilohertz?
No, it's a little bit wider than that. It's about 150 kilohertz.
Okay.
The full bandwidth of the channel.
Yep.
It's the best way to describe Tetra is a cellular phone network.
Right.
It's based off the same concept. The only difference being is, instead of being on 800 megs or wherever, it's on a commercial frequency in the UHF
So
range.
it's just dumbed down GSM.
Yeah, it
It's
is.
like 8 time slots.
Yeah. And the voice quality, depending on the brand of the radio, some radios are configured really nicely for Tetra, and some are not. But that's the nature of those limits. And Tetra isn't used here in Tasmania commercially. It is used in Sydney for the trains, and it is used in WA in the mining industry. But they're not using it for its full capacity. They're just using it pretty much as a what's known as DMO mode. It's a direct mode. Whereas when it's in trunking mode, that's the other thing too. The 4 time slots is only in the trunking. It's not in direct mode. But that said, you can still address as time slots on the DMO, and so you can still filter by time slot, even though it's a bit funky how it does it. But, that's another whole topic for another
What's the next
time.
talk?
Oh no, I'm not up with it yet.
Scott,
this is all very interesting, and for those of us who may have just swung past Clayton's servo and had our GD77s reprogrammed by him every time the repeater changes,
Yeah.
how do we make them work on our own hotspot?
Right. Well, this is where, in the case of, I don't have a copy of whatever Clayton's circulating, but you need to set up a separate channel yourself for your hotspot. Now, as I say, I don't have a copy of what Clayton's been working on lately. I probably should get a copy of it. And let's just use a hypothetical at the moment because I don't know. Let's just say he's put one in there called hotspot. You'd have to find out what frequency it's set for to then know what frequency to put your hotspot on. And on that, then each channel would be set up, should be set up the same as it should be. So if you need timeslot 2 for a given talk group, it's done in that process.
Right, so what you're saying is you need to set up a new zone.
Correct.
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
that's true. Yes, yeah, yeah.
Use the word channel, I don't know.
Yeah,
Channel
sorry,
sounds
no,
like
no.
a talk group to me.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to...
That's you raise a valid point actually. The lingo, yeah, contact is somebody's ID number. That's a contact. A talk group is a designated number that you're going to talk on, and then you've got the zone, which is how the radio is programmed. In the original DMR sense, it was limited to 16 channels because it was a 16-channel rotary switch on the radios. So you had 16 channels that you could program into a zone. Now those zones could be any number and any time slot. So in the case of the hotspot, yes, you need to have a zone set up specifically, first of all, a channel, which is a channel as in a frequency, set up. Let's just say 439, 150. Then you would set up a zone where you attach into that, you put your talk groups, which is your contacts, into that zone. So you could make a zone with say 5, 3809, 3810, 505, 3807, right, those 5. Put those into that. Now you will need a rewrite rule, but we'll cover that later. And then in that zone on the radio it will display as whatever, let's just say channel 1 is 505, channel 2 is 3807. It's all on 438 150, but it's just what you name the channel as well, sorry, the zone / channel.
So you attach the channel to the zone and you attach talk groups to the zone.
Yep. Yep.
And then you can operate.
I'm just trying to think of another way to describe it that's far more simplistic than that, but unfortunately it differs between radio manufacturers too. So for example, if we go down the Motorola path, it's pretty much just how we explained it. You've got the contact, you've got the channel, you've got the talk group, you've got the zone. So you've got those 4 things to deal with. Now when it comes to something like a GD77 that's not running the Open GD77 project, you're opening up another can of worms where it's got to have the channel, it's got to have the contact, it's got to have a receive group, it's got to have the zone. Because the limitation with the GD77 is, for whatever reason, if you set a channel up with whatever talk group, instead of it automatically saying, oh, that's what I've got to listen to, no, you've got to tell it that's what you've got to listen to. That's why the Open GD77 project far simplifies that radio considerably, because essentially all you then have to do when programming that with the modified firmware is you're worried about the contact, the channel and the zone. There's only 3 things you've got to worry about. And the zone, sorry, you can group the talk groups as a talk group. I'm just trying to think of what it's called I think it is called just that actually. So what you then do is, for example, I would put all the current talk groups that you want to use in the VK DMR network into that group, and then you just attach that group to the channel. And that's it. Simple as that. You don't have to go through with every single individual one. And then what happens is when you power on the radio, you press your up and down arrows to go through the channels, and your left and rights to go through the talk groups of what's pre-programmed in. when seeing the original firmware versus the modified firmware, you'll see how much it sounds more complicated, but as far as the end user usability, far more simpler. Because you end up, instead of having to program, say, I don't know, let's just say we wanted to monitor 10 different talk groups, well, that's 10 channels you've got to make to then attach into a zone. Whereas with the OpenGD77, it's one channel of whatever the frequency is you need, and then you're attaching the talk groups in as a group onto that. Far more simpler than having to duplicate it 10, 15, 20 times or whatever. And then in that case, depending on how many repeaters you want to set up in the radio, you've got to multiply it by that as well. So the OpenGD77 project has a lot going for it in that aspect. It simplifies programming of the radio considerably. It's a little bit of faffing around to get it onto the radio and to get used to it, but once you're there, it's well worth it. And that's from somebody that doesn't actually use it that much. But I've used it enough to know that comparing from how you did the radio with its original firmware that it came with versus what it's at the moment, yeah, I know what I'd prefer to program. Which brings me to another note too. There's code plugs that are actually on the Reast website that need updating. I will get there one day. Hopefully not too soon, but yeah, too far away. But yeah.
Anyone who's got an MD380, I'm happy to share a hotspot configuration for an MD380.
Yeah, that's the other thing too to be careful is, it's fine to say, hey, give me a code plug to do X, Y, Z, but you might have a certain hierarchical system in your head of how you want things to be, and somebody else is going to have a completely different idea to how you do it. Now, the ones that I've distributed over the years, I look at them in a logical kind of path, but I'm sure some people will look at those things and they'll go, what the heck is this guy on about, you know? It's got to a point where, what's he talking about, you know? The abbreviations that I use, because you've got a limit of how many characters you can put in to describe the thing, that kind of thing. And again, that's where the GD77 helps in that field too, because the character limit's been expanded out to 32, I think now, whereas before it was limited to 16. The only downside of that is it does scroll, so you don't get it all in one go. But yeah, so obviously you've got to.
Clayton helps me with set up the code plug in there. Yeah. So it's got the latest, I think the custom.
Yep.
Firmware.
Yeah. The I mean, that's kind of going off a bit too far of a tangent, but the OpenGD77 project, there was a bit of a confusion over the licensing of it, because some of the binary blobs that have been borrowed from the original firmware are still in their original binary blob form, which means that's not open source software, that's closed source commercial. So it had to be rewritten so that the original code from Radioddity is put into the radio, and then as an overlay the OpenGD77 stuff gets put over the top, mapped within certain ways to make it all work. Whereas before you used to just put a binary blob into the radio and it was a combination of code. Somebody said, oh, not quite right, can't do that, so it's been separated out. Now it's a little bit more physical with how you actually do that. There's a few more files you've got to download and a little bit more chopping and changing you'll do in the radio, but once it's set up, and then all you've got to do is just update, and the update process is far simpler than actually putting the original firmware on. That's really a talk for another another time as well. Although I did do a talk on OpenGD77 last year, but it was during COVID, and I know that my system crashed a few times while we were doing that one. So, but it's come a long way since then. It's actually changed considerably since then.
And that's on the
should be on the YouTube channel, yeah. As I say, my connection drops a few times, but yeah. Because as you know, the club went through and got a certain amount of GD77, so they are one of the more, what's the word, popular is probably not the right word.
familiar.
There's many more of them in the club than
You know, I've got a Motorola sitting over there, which I know nobody else in this room's going to have. So, and that one's not DMR. That's what, you know, that's the most common one. So when I say there's a code plug that I'll be distributing, it'll go through the club, but it'll be set up with a single zone as a hotspot. The only thing you'd need to do with that zone is change the frequency if you don't want it on the given frequency that it's on. And that would be it's a fairly simple process to do that. There's just two fields to change the frequency. Because that is one of the downsides with sharing code plugs too, is that not everything that's in that code plug is relevant to your area. A few years ago there was a few people that were really keen to make code plugs to cover the whole country, but you ended up with so much stuff inside that radio that, you know, 9/10 of it you weren't ever using. So unless you're specifically going to a particular area, there is no point having it in your radio. The ones that I've made have been strictly VK7 limited, so both FM repeaters, 2 and 70 centimetres, and digital for the north and the south. And that's all they have. They don't have anything else, and they're limited to the amateur bands only in the transmit field. Which, unless you hold a license elsewhere, which the GD7 is not compliant for, you shouldn't be transmitting elsewhere anyway.
I recall the type error I've got is the zones are actually set up for different states. So
Yeah,
as you're travelling around,
you've probably got one of the original ones that was done by Det. I can't even remember his call sign. I think it's VK2KVP. Anyway, there's a few that are kicking around that cover the whole country, and some of them, for some of it now, is probably irrelevant. Like in WA a few years ago, when there was a change in the DMR network, most of VK6 said no, we're not going to have part of that, and opted out. So you'd have VK6 repeaters that are on that in that configuration that are no longer valid. The repeaters are still valid, they're just no longer on that network, so the talk groups would be irrelevant to use. And that's the other important thing too, is each DMR we're using DMR as specific here, each DMR network is unique in the talk group range numbers that they use. For example, on the VK DMR for the state-based numbers, it's 3801 to 3808 for your VK1 through to VK8. On Brandmeister, it's 5051 to 5058 on the Brandmeister network, so it's a 5000 series number as opposed to a 3000 series. Now in the background, they are permanently bridged. So if you're on the VK DMR network, you transmit on 3807, simultaneously you're actually going to come out on the Brandmeister network on 5057, and vice versa. If you're on Brandmeister 5057, you'll come out on the VK DMR on 3807. That's the only 8 talk groups that are bridged. People have been complaining that 505 should have been bridged, but no. 505 on either of the networks can get really busy, or it's as quiet as a mouse for weeks. You know, it goes through stages. At the moment, I'd say DMR is in a bit of a lull as far as how much is being used. You go back to when COVID hit, the first lot of lockdowns and all that, all digital modes spiked because it was like, we're sitting at home, we're bored, what are we going to do? So, yeah, but then that's slowly petered off.
Questions for Scott?
Have I satisfyingly made you very confused? That's what I want to know. Sometimes I have the issue where what's in my head, conveying it to other people in a way that you're I don't want to say it offensively, not to dumb it down, but to convey it in a way that's understandable, I sometimes lack. So if there is something that I've said that you don't understand, just by all means, just ask.
Well, a curious one, back onto your dashboard.
Yep. Which one? The Pi-Star one?
Yeah.
Yep.
where the location, no, not that one, sorry. Yeah,
I'll go back to the status.
on the
Is it like here where?
status, where you go down that column where you are,
Yeah.
in the brackets, what are the numbers that keep changing there?
That's the countdown timer that the channel's going to be active for. So in that
Right.
case, it's 30 seconds.
Yeah.
That comes back to that question that was asked about the time span on time slots. On talk groups. That is what this is specific for the VK DMR
Yeah.
one. So in that case, whatever was active. Okay, 3807 looked like it must have been active there at one stage. That's going to sit there for 30 seconds until it either gets more traffic going through it,
Yeah.
and as you can see, it's counting down again. So it depends who's listening. As you can see, there's actually quite a few, not just VK7s that are monitoring 3807. It's Australia wide. Anyone can monitor it. Let's get down a bit further. Sorry, this must be really blurry up on the thing. So if you key up again, you should see a green one there somewhere. There you are. No, that was the
hang on,
link.
I'll key up again.
No, we have to go up a bit.
Green's gone down. Hang on.
No, because this is hotspots. So he's coming in via RF, via the RAD.
And I'm coming by RCR because ROD is not letting me.
Yeah, because RCR at the moment is on
Okay.
D-Star. That's the other thing with RAD. If you've got your radio, and in the case of the GD77, if you've got a green LED lit and you're not hearing anything, it's because it's in a different mode other than DMR. So it could be in D-Star, could be in P25, could be in C4FM, NXDN. So that is obviously the nature of the repeater. It is set up so that it is multi-mode, and it is first in, first serve. And it is still set with the default 20-second timeouts per mode. So
Is it actually a true repeater? Can you talk through the local repeater?
Yes. Like if you decided that you didn't want to go out across the net, the best talk group to use is talk group 9.
No, but even if you do, the other people on the same, listening to the same repeater will hear an output from your input signal.
Correct.
Like on a
Yeah.
traditional- Okay.
Yeah, just like a normal standard FM repeater.
Yeah,
It's just digital.
So it's not just a gateway, it is a repeater.
Yeah, well, it's an internet gateway, but at the same time, it is also a RF repeater. Whereas a hotspot is just an internet gateway with an RF component attached to it. That's the main difference between the hotspots. Have got most of them are using the ADF 7021 chip, whereas a repeater doesn't have that chip. It's usually got headers that you then connect either to in this case out in the back room, it's the Yaesu DR-1X, goes into the I/O port in the back of the radio, which I'm sure Yaesu are actually a little bit annoyed about, because nearly every single Yaesu DR-1X that was sold 2 years or 3 years ago, when they were on special for club use, instead of being put on the native YSF Yaesu system, nearly all of them are on multi-mode MMDVM. So the Yaesu DR-2X fixed that problem. you can't feed into the back of it like you can with the one. So if you ever want to buy yourself a repeater to do that kind of thing, go with the Yaesu DR-1X if you can still get them, because they're not manufactured anymore. They're all 2Xs. Yeah, Yaesu made a blunder there. But, that's not to say that in the future, if for whatever reason that repeater wants to become a dedicated YSX repeater, there's nothing stopping that from being the case. It just needs one extra piece of hardware purchase and a Windows terminal to run the software. The way it's running at the moment is far more efficient.
Scott, what's the effective range of a digital repeater there?
Alright, that's a good question. Now mostly it comes up as 32 kilometres.
Is that a time slot thing?
That is a time slot thing, yeah. Now, however, I've been on top of Mount Wellington with a handheld, and I've keyed into the Launceston repeater. Now, granted, I could key it, but I couldn't have a conversation. because the drift where I was drifting in and out of time slot, I think it was time slot 1 I was trying to use, was I was there, I wasn't there, I was there, it was enough to break it, get into it, key it up, but not enough to have a conversation. You know, and that's what, 200 and something kilometres. So yeah, it is the distance over time governs that's for TDMA based systems. When it comes to things like D-Star, which is not TDMA, the limit is really just how clear the signal is without any residual background noise, which is that's variable. I mean, D-Star has been used on the IC 7100s on HF successfully on 10 metres. C4FM on the Yaesu radios has been used successfully on 10 metres for considerable distance. Again, those two modes are not TDMA, they are just they're C4FM based, with the exception of D-Star.
How well you may or may not be able to answer this question. How well does it do multipathing with something like DMR? How well does it cope with it?
Well, not very good, in that if you do have a lot of multipath, you just won't receive the signal. It just won't be there because it can't resolve, can't lock on, etc., etc. So multipath is not really a problem because the radios can't deal with it. So it's not a problem, but it's a big problem because obviously if you've got multipath, you don't have a working system. However, it either works or it doesn't. That's, you know, it's on or it's off kind of thing.
It's sort of the clip effect, but not really.
Well, that's where you can say, is it really effective if it can't handle a bit of multipath? Well, the mode was never designed to handle multipath.
Well, I was just thinking that TasGRN is going to have to deal with this in Tasmania.
Well, you'll find there that they'll have voting groups set up so that radios are not just stuck on one frequency. They'll be spanning across multiple towers. That's a whole other kettle of fish, really. But essentially that's a voting system which comes back into your trunk network. That's the advantage of a trunk over conventional, but you won't get a trunk network on an amateur service. It's just not affordable.
Something slightly different. The P25 and the NXDN, which I've never heard of before.
Yep.
Do you get many people on them?
Yeah. Me? I primarily hang out on P25.
Okay. What's the quality like on that one? About the same as DMR?
Much better.
Oh,
No,
okay.
it's okay. This is a controversial topic. What's the better mode? Now, if we're talking recovered audio, there's a lot of factors that come into this, but in my book, it's P25,
yep.
NXDN, C4FM, DMR, D-Star. That's how I would rate the modes as far as what they sound like. That's just my opinion. Others will vary. Now, that said, there's nothing saying if you've got, I don't want to use the term a proper radio, but if you've got a commercial branded radio that its only job is to receive a given mode, then that's going to be better at doing that than your cheaper Chinese entry-level device. There's nothing wrong with the radio, with the GD77 as a radio, but when it comes to how it's constructed, and it's built to a price. It's not built to a quality or a standard, it's built to a price. Whereas when you go into commercial gear, it's built to a specification, not a price. You're paying commercial gear, you're paying big bucks for the commercial gear. A P25 radio on the second-hand market can vary anything. For that particular model, you're looking anything $500 plus. And that's before you even look at programming it and multiple other facets of that.
Because I was looking at some of the Motorola handhelds. I know I'll never be able to get it, but there's a...
For DMR.
P25.
Oh, P25, yeah.
There's a really fancy one.
The APX.
Yeah. About $4,000.
Yeah.
Just over $4,000.
Yeah, well, when these TAS police go into the GRN, they're all going to have APX 8000s, which are multi-band radios. and they are about $4 grand a radio. So every police person you see with a radio on them that's $4 grand, just say g'day taxpayers' money, because that's that's what it comes down to. But that's made to do a job and do it well. The price point at that point doesn't enter the equation. But, yeah. Well, that's the other thing too, is a lot of the Chinese entry-level DMR radios are just that. They're entry-level radios. They're designed to do a job, not necessarily do it well, but they're designed to do a job, and that's what's flooded the market. You know, people have bought them because they're cheap.
Yep.
Now, if digital radio had taken off in a different way within amateur radio, and it was just everybody buys X commercial gear, that'd be a completely different ball game. And would it be better? Possibly. Would it be more fun to actually mess around with? No, it wouldn't, because commercial radios are stuck to programming in a particular way, whereas amateurs like to have a VFO. They like to be able to not just stay stuck on a given frequency, whereas channelized radios are just that. They're channelized radios. The GD77 in its original firmware is a channelized configuration. A very clunky one, but still a channelized way of doing it. Yeah, you shouldn't have gone down that path. I'll be here for hours.
So the fundamental advantage of DMR is that you can have more throughput on a given frequency.
Well,
the
it's
same amount of time as the time slotting arrangement.
yes, yeah. Well, the whole purpose of DMR, its whole original concept, was to get more bandwidth usage per channel. So look at it from a commercial block of frequencies. The government wants to sell this block, but at the same time we want the maximum amount of usage, so we need a system that'll do that. So the European Union came up with the DMR spec, which specified essentially 2 time slots, separated at 30 milliseconds apart. There's a few other timings involved there, and that allowed 2 conversations to happen on the one frequency at the same time. So that was better than having one narrowband FM channel, which DMR takes up 12.5k, give or take. So you've got your 2 conversations in that 12.5k, whereas narrow FM generally is around the 10, 12k. You've got 2 conversations over the one. So it's just a progress of trying to be more efficient with frequency spectrum. I suppose there's a monetary element to it there as well, but that's what it comes down to. And when you come into other modes like P25, that's the same again. In phase 3, that's full TDMA trunk, so it's still 2 time slots, but it's the same again. It's fully spread over multiple frequencies over multiple this, so you end up with a better use of frequency all up, which kind of comes back to the Tetra thing again. That's 4 time slots. That's a slightly wider transmission though, but at the same time it's essentially doing the same thing. It's just putting more conversations on the one frequency. That's the crux of it really.
So my final question would be, do any of the amateur DMR systems support telemetry?
Yes, Brandmeister network does. You can send simple text messaging on Brandmeister. It will work on the VK DMR network, but they don't encourage it. In fact, they prefer you didn't. There is sometimes a limitation where it may only work over the repeater that you're using, so locally only. Brandmeister, however, have actually brought in a store forward. So you send a message to somebody, and if they're not on air, as soon as their radio logs in, it'll dump any messages that have been sent to them. I haven't tested that yet, but
I've sent one text message on the GD77, and that's probably more work than it was.
It's going back to good old T9 days.
I'm like, no, I just can't do
It's
that.
quicker to press the button and say "oi" than it is to go "oi." You said about 17 key presses to go "oi," and 1 key press to say it. But sometimes text messaging is handy. Now, text messaging Now we're talking, if we go back to the basis of the actual mode, yes, DMR supports simple messaging between radio to radio. So does NXDN, so does P25, C4FM and D-Star, because they are essentially amateur spins on a digital thing. They don't have it natively, but they do through software as using the radio like a modem, in effect. But the commercial specs all do simple messaging. However, in the amateur realm, the way that P25 and NXDN have been implemented, it's only passing the voice packets. All the IDs for a voice packet get passed, everything else gets dropped. So it's looking at a protocol level there. So I can't remember what the protocol headers are, but you've got a certain range that is for certain tasks within the mode, and I think it's ID 68, 67, 68, 69 are to do with voice traffic, and it'll pass all that, and it'll just drop everything else. And that's the same for P25 and NXDN. Dealt with that way through the MMDVM system. If you're using a native P25 system, like I've got a Motorola Quantar at home, which is native P25. So with the XTL, I can use all the functions on that exist on P25. And a mate of mine that's in New South Wales, we've got it set up so that if I want to message him, I can. We don't do that, but we can. Mainly all we use is paging. So if I wanted to talk to him specifically, instead of putting out a call, I can just page him, and his radio will either beep or it's essentially like a cell call. And you say, that's not very amateur-like. That's
I was thinking about something like control facilities.
yeah, oh yeah.
What we do in tape use a thing called GridLink,
Yeah.
which is an extension on DMR where you can actually have voice and data simultaneously
Yeah.
over the trunk network.
Yeah.
It's done in the commercial.
That's it. I mean, go down that path. Yeah, use the commercial gear. You can use all the bells and whistles it comes with, providing you've got the relevant licenses, and modes enabled, etc. Not everything is free, unfortunately. All right, we about worn this one out.
Any last questions? I have been valiantly trying to get some questions out of our streaming audience,
Which is 0.
and I've got 0, so I've given up there. They did say that DMR equals do more radio.
Do more radio. Okay.
DMR.
DMR.
So, yeah. So DMR enables amateurs to do more radio.
That's one way of saying it. I wonder what D-Star is there.
But can we show our appreciation, please?
One other thing that I'll touch on that's only relevant to people that have got Yaesu C4FM gear, but RAD has just been put on the new Australian reflector, which is YSF 505. It's done by Peter Brennan, so the same guy that runs the VK DMR network, and he's set up a couple of servers initially with room to expand. So RAD was actually the first repeater put onto that network. He rang me up and he said, "What are you doing on a particular Saturday afternoon?" And I said, "Not much." He said, "Do you want to have an experiment with this?" And I said, "Yeah, okay." And so it's so this dashboard obviously shows what RAD is. That's this here. The FCS 50550 is essentially YCS 505. There's a reason why it's an FCS one in this particular case, because Pi-Star doesn't support the YCS protocol at the moment, so it's bridged. And that's just C4FM narrow mode. So for those in the Yaesu realm, that's DN mode. And to use that, you've just basically used the repeater as a repeater. There's no special configuration. The repeater's already connected to it. You don't have to do anything within your menu system to connect to it. It's already there. So occasionally, this is where it comes back to that. if your radio is displaying a green LED but you're not hearing anything, it's because it's most likely in a different mode. And each mode has a 20-second hang time. So in this case there's a D-star conversation going on. That particular call sign, or that particular mode, will stay active for 20 seconds after the last key down, unless somebody else keys up, and then it'll go back into listening mode, or it's listening for any mode. I will note that NXDN and P25 are a little slower to be picked up by the repeater than the other modes, and I'm not sure why that is. It's the same on the system at home, so it must be just a hardware thing. But anyway, they still work. It just, you know, instead of just keying up quickly on P25, you've got to hold it in for about a second before it'll actually pick it up. But most of yours are not on P25 or NXDN, so not really a problem.
So is ROD doing Fusion natively? Or
No, through MMDVM.
Right. Okay.
No, that was the ultimate decision way back when that was got, was do we just use it as a C4FM FM/C4FM repeater, which is how Yaesu wanted them to be used. And if you wanted that to go onto the internet, there was a few other bits and pieces you had to buy to make that happen. But just as a standalone repeater, that could have been a C4FM and FM repeater, and that's all it would have been. Whereas the route that it went, it's now multi-mode, and so you get the best of 5 worlds. And really, out of the 5 modes that are active, it's primarily D-Star and DMR are the predominant ones, as you'll note there in the active modes, especially on a Wednesday night when there's a broadcast on D-Star. I suppose that kind of comes down to if there's anything where there might be something that's on the repeater that you think it shouldn't be, or maybe there's something that's not on there that you think there should be, speak up and just say, because the way it's been set up is the way it's been set up, and it's always available to change. You know, at the moment, for example, it's monitoring certain. So that's the Fusion one that's fairly new. So that's that. It does have the ability through C4FM to cross over into Brandmeister, but the chances of that being a real thing is, unless you know how to use it, but it is available. In P25 world, it's monitoring 10400, which is the Pacific zoned area of monitoring, and the NXDN realm 65,000. That's the worldwide group, and of the latter two there, they are the least frequented talk groups of those modes. Hence why, you know, there's no point having the RAD constantly keep down on P25 if nobody's got gear for P25. It's a waste of time. But there's nothing stopping you from using an SDR and some software, and you can monitor these modes. That's probably another talk for another night.
There is, for those people who are on the Discord channels, there is a DMR chat Discord channel, text channel. So if you're watching something or see something or want more information, that's probably a good place to shoot a question through.
And I'm monitoring that, so I've got that one set up for notifications. Nearly everything else on Discord's set to no notifications.
So, and if me saying Discord, you're wondering what I'm talking about, have a look at the email newsletter that goes out, and shoot an email through to the secretary if you want more information.
Yeah. Other than that,
Cool.
I think I'm done. Everybody
very
looks
much.
satisfiedly confused, so
Cheers.
I've achieved my goal.